Hey guys, I'm Bound to Divide and welcome to my Diva course. Over the next few hours we're going to be going over all the parameters, buttons and knobs available in Diva and just cover what they do and how they work. Now this course is for people who already have a basic understanding of synthesis. I'm not going to get into what an envelope is and how it works and what an LFO is, so I'd expect you to at least have a basic understanding of subtractive synthesis. If you don't, I would recommend first learning a bit about subtractive synthesis. There's something called Syntorial that I used when I was starting out, and that really helped me get a basic understanding. I'll put a link to it in the description, so I recommend using that. And then coming back to this. So this is more for the person who already has a basic understanding of synthesis, but maybe bought Diva and doesn't fully understand how to use it yet. The only thing I won't be covering in this course is the presets panel, just because I feel like it's really intuitive and, you know, it's not really a part of, you know, the complexity of the synth. So you can pretty much just click on the UHE logo and go to the user guide if you have any questions about this panel. Same as the preferences over here, I'm not going to cover those. So the rest of all the other knobs, the modifications, trimmers, the scope, everything else is covered in this course. I've also added timestamps, so you can fast forward to any sections that you want to jump to if you wish. But yeah, that's enough for now. Let's get started. Okay, so we're just going to start right at the top and basically go through everything, every single panel one by one, every single knob, and explain exactly what each of them does and how they affect the sound. But let's first start at the top panel. So right at the top left, you'll see there's a save button. Pretty self-explanatory. You click it when you want to save a preset, and you just enter the preset name, the author, bit of a description, and then some usage, like, you know, maybe you've got a mod wheel assigned to something, and you want the user to understand that, for example, the mod wheel controls cutoff would be something that you could write in usage. Okay, then next up we've got the Diva logo, we've got MIDI activity, and that just basically will light up, that little LED will light up every time it detects MIDI input. So at the moment I am just hitting the A key on my keyboard. That's sending the C note to Diva, and we can see the light up. Okay, and then we've got this little display, and it tells you who Diva's registered to. It also tells you the version, and then it also just gives you information, you know, as you hover over stuff. It'll tell you what each thing is, and then if you adjust it, it tells you the amount also that it's being adjusted to. So we're going up 12 semitones there. So you can see that goes to 12. Then next up, we've got these forward and back buttons. So if I change something, you'll see that lights up, and I can change lots of stuff, and I can just undo things that I've done, which is pretty cool, and I can go forwards in time too. And this is also like, there's no limit to the amount of times you can step backwards or forwards. So it's a very, very handy feature. You know, if you're working on a sound for half an hour, but you preferred how it sounded half an hour ago, you can just step back all the way to how it sounded before, no problem. Okay, and then this multi-core feature over here that basically enables multi-core support. So if you have a CPU that can handle multi-core processing, it might bring down your CPU usage to enable multi-core. But my advice would be to just test it and see, you know, if you have a busy patch and your CPU usage is really high, try turning on multi-core, and see if it makes it better. It could make it worse depending on a number of factors. So just test that out. And then we've got the output amount, and that's just the amount of volume that Diva is going to put out. So there's two different places you can control the output volume, and this is basically the last one in the chain, and that has no effect on the tone, unless obviously you're going into another plugin and that's causing it to clip. So the other place you can control it is on the volume, and that's in the basically Amplifier Pan section. And the difference between these two is that if you drive the volume too high here, it will affect the tone. You'll get some distortion. It might be a desirable kind of analog distortion, but this won't change the tone at all. So just bear that in mind when you're adjusting volume, that this is like the cleaner version of this. Then we've got the Yuhi logo over here, and you can basically go to the user guide and all the other socials and the support forum just by clicking on that. And that's it pretty much for the little top panel over there. In the next section we're going to go over this the VCO and explain that. Okay, so onto the VCO section. The first thing I just want to quickly gloss over is that Diva is almost like a modular kind of synth. So you'll see at the bottom here of each section there's these labels, and if you click on them you can select different versions, and we'll get into each one of these and explain them, but just know that you can switch stuff out, and it's pretty versatile. You know, you've got tons of different models and stuff, and they're all kind of modeled after classic analog synths. So the first one we're going to go over is the triple VCO. So this is basically your oscillator section, and this is like modeled off the Mini Moog. It's probably the highest CPU usage out of any of the other oscillator versions here. So just bear that in mind, but it's probably my favorite of the bunch. It sounds really good, especially for things like bass lines, you know, things that the Mini Moog does really well. So starting right at the left, we have this envelope 2 tune mod. So what this does is it basically controls the tuning of each of the oscillators. So there's 3 switches. This controls the first oscillator, the second oscillator, and the third oscillator. So if we enable this and you see the white switch, that means it's switched on. We can now modulate the tune of the first oscillator using envelope 2. There's you can click this little label here, and we can use envelope 1 or the LFO or mod wheel, any sort of modulation source that we want from this list. So just keep that in mind. And how this will sound, if I just switch this on, or if I switch it off now, this is how the patch sounds as it is, as I've just opened Diva. If I enable tune mod on the first oscillator, first oscillator is actually switched off at the moment. Let me turn it up. Let me turn off all the other ones so that we can hear this. Okay, so it's pretty much just a plain saw wave at the moment. We enable tune mod and we increase the amount. So this knob controls the amount. It's now following the decay of this envelope because it's enabled on envelope 2. If I shorten this, it'll get quicker. But you must also remember that this envelope 2 is controlling the filter cutoff, so it's kind of hard to hear. Another way we could show this is if we set it to, let's say, LFO 1. Now it's using this LFO 1 to modulate the tuning. So let me just play that. So you can hear it's kind of like wobbling. If I exaggerate it, you'll hear it even more. We can play with the rate here. You can get some pretty cool sounds out of that. And then if you wanted, you could also modulate the other one. And then you switch those off if you don't want it anymore. And that's basically just this little section over here, and that's what that does. And then we get the shape mod. And that is, it works the same as this section, as in you can use these switches to control which oscillator it's modulating. But instead of modulating the tuning, we're now modulating the shape of the waveform. So if you look at these waveforms, for example, if I just only enable the volume on oscillator 1, if I turn this dial, you'll see how it switches between, we've got saw waves, pulse waves, triangle. And you'll notice that this is not, it's not like a switch. It's not switching from a saw wave to a pulse wave. It's almost like it morphs into a pulse wave. Almost like a wavetable. And what the shape mod does is it's basically modulating this this knob. So it's like swinging backwards and forwards depending on the amount that you do. So if I enable it on oscillator 1 and then increase the amount, we are now using LFO2, which is this one, to modulate this knob over here. I don't want to use LFO2, I'm going to actually use envelope 2 for this. And you can hear as I increase this, the characteristic is going to change because it's going to be sweeping further and further. And if we want the full range of waveforms, we can start right at the left. Yeah, so that's what that does. And the same thing if you wanted to control it on only a single or multiple ones, you just use these switches. Okay, and then moving on, we have an FM section over here. If you don't know what FM is, that's a bit beyond the topic of this video, but just know that it is basically controlling the frequency of one oscillator by using the frequency of another one. So if you increase the FM, tends to make stuff nice and gritty, but doing it too much will almost like detune it and make it go out of key. And how this one works is with using the pitch of oscillator 1 to modulate the pitch of oscillator 2 and 3. So if we turn on oscillator 2 and 3, that's how that sounds now. If I start to increase the FM, it starts to get pretty gnarly. So it's a really cool feature. I use it quite a lot, but just be careful with it. And another thing to note that when using FM, you can often get a really nice effect just by changing the range here, so pitching stuff down an octave. Even going further. And you can turn off the volume of oscillator 1 because it's only really being used as an LFO now. You can have it up and you will hear it, but you don't need it for FM to work. So just bear in mind you can turn down volume, or you can have that volume back if you want. Okay, so that covers the FM section. Then I've already explained the tune mod and the shape mod. These are just the amount knobs. And just to explain another thing that I've just done over here is when I increase this, you'll see I reset it back to its original position just by double clicking on it. So any knob here, you can reset it back to its original position by double clicking on it. And that's pretty handy. And okay, so next we get up into the range section and the detune section. And these are basically just controlling the pitch of the oscillators. So we can change these control the octaves. If I turn this up and turn the other ones down, we'll be able to hear. If I turn this up, it goes up an octave. Okay, and the same thing with 2 and 3. And then the detune just allows you to detune it in granular amounts. And these numbers are basically semitones. So we've got 1 semitone up there, 3. We can't detune oscillator 1, so you won't be able to hear that. But if I turn up oscillator 2, start to detune it. And you'll hear that. Another thing to note with the detune knob is that you can turn it past its maximum, or what looks like its maximum. If you watch the number, it'll keep rising. At the moment it's at 5, but I can increase it up to 7. And what happens when you go over this point, this white line, is this switch will jump up to the next octave. So if you want to go up to 7, you want it to go up 7 semitones, which is a perfect fifth, which is something that people quite commonly want to do. You might think, oh, this only goes up to 5, but in reality it does go up to 7. So just keep turning the knob. The more you turn it, the higher this octave will jump until you reach the highest point, and then the knob will stop turning. Okay, and the same thing in the opposite direction, we'll turn it down. Okay, and then we've got the sync button over here, and that basically just controls, it synchronizes oscillator 1 or oscillator 2, sorry, not oscillator 1 and 2, oscillator 2 and oscillator 3. So it just synchronizes them with oscillator 1. And in the manual they say that having oscillator 1, like if you want a nice effect with the sync or to be able to actually hear what it's doing, you would probably want oscillator 1 to be at a lower octave. So yeah, slightly different effect there. If you don't really understand sync, it's just synchronizing basically the phase of the oscillators to oscillator 1. Okay, and then we've just got these waveform dials, and these are just controlling the waveform as I explained earlier on. We've got different shapes here. This is like almost like a reverse saw wave, similar to that. Very slightly different characteristics, and that morphs into a triangle wave over here. And then we've got another saw wave, and then we've got the pulse wave, and then that's basically goes to a shorter pulse width. Okay, and then as part of this VCO, this triple VCO comes with a little mixer. You know, not all of the other ones have that mixer. And in the mixer, we've got a volume knob, which is controlling the volume of the first oscillator, the second oscillator, and the third oscillator. And then we've got a feedback section, or feedback knob. And how feedback works is basically what they used to do with the analog synths, like the Mini Moog, is take the output of the signal and then plug it back to the input. So the signal gets fed back into the synth and then goes back out. And if you turn up the feedback, you'll notice that it starts to get like a little bit more bassy. And it also gets like these like distorted, like almost howling effects. But what also happens as like a side effect of turning up the feedback is that the resonance of the filter gets reduced. So if you pay attention to the filter, sound kind of starts to get a bit flat. So what you need to do to compensate for that is to just increase the resonance. On this one, it's called emphasis. And that kind of fixes that problem, although you might prefer the sound of it with no resonance. It's up to you. But just know that when you're increasing feedback and it starts to sound a bit flat, increasing the resonance will help. Okay, and then we have a noise section, and this just controls the volume of the noise oscillator, noise generator. And there's a switch, you can switch it from pink to white. And the difference between pink is that pink noise is like, it's got a slope to it. It's kind of like higher in the bass frequencies and lower in the higher frequencies. And white noise is pretty much just a flat across the frequency spectrum kind of noise. Most of the time you'll probably be using white noise. Okay, so that's it for our triple VCO oscillator. In the next video we're going to go over our next one, which is the dual VCO. Okay, so now that we've covered the triple VCO module, let's go on to the dual VCO. Okay, so the dual VCO, similar to the triple VCO, except it has 2 oscillators now instead of 3. And starting from the left, we have this PW slider, which stands for pulse width. So if you have a look at these oscillators, they have a number of waveforms. We have a triangle waveform, a saw waveform, and this, which is the pulse waveform. And what this controls is the width of the pulse. And if you don't really understand what I mean, we can have a look at the scope here. And this basically just displays the waveform. If I hit a key, we're now looking at the saw wave. And that's because we've got this mix knob turned to the right, which means that we're only hearing VCO2. So if I turn that to the left, we'll now see the pulse wave. And that's currently being modulated. So if I just set this to 0, turn the modulation off, we're now seeing like a pure pulse wave. And then to explain the pulse width, if I slide this up and down, the width of that sort of square shape is going to change until it's eventually silent. And if I bring it down, it gets wider and wider. And then we almost get to silence again. So basically the pulse width is just controlling that width of the pulse wave. And then it has this little arrow going down to the selector. We can set it to 1 or 1 plus 2. So that that means we can either control just the pulse width of oscillator 1. So let's say we had both of these set to pulse waves and we had the mix knob in the center. So we're hearing now both oscillators. We can control the width of just oscillator 1, which will create a different kind of tone, or we can do both. Okay, and going on to the next slider, this is the modulation of the pulse width. At the moment it's set to LFO2, so if I increase this, it's going to start modulating the pulse width using this LFO2. If I increase that, you can now see that starts to move up and down. If I increase the rate of LFO2, we do it faster and faster. Okay, and we can select different modulation sources over here. You can use envelopes, LFOs, pitch wheels, whatever you want. Okay, so moving on to this little knob over here. This controls the pitch of oscillator 1. And yeah, that's basically just controlling the octave. So each step is a different octave. And then you can also do the same thing on oscillator 2, except oscillator 2 has another pitch control, which is this detune knob. You can't detune oscillator 1, only oscillator 2. So if I had to set this to the middle so that we're hearing both oscillators at the exact same volume, I could then detune the second one and we could create like different harmonics, like perfect fits. For example. And just like the triple VCO, you can turn this knob past what appears to be its maximum point, and it'll essentially jump this knob down. If I turn it down, you can see it's now popped down to 16. Keep going. It's now at 32. So yeah, you can keep turning it until it reaches its maximum point, which will be over there. Okay. And then just covering these, I've already glossed over these, but we have our triangle wave over here, which looks like that. Got a saw wave, pulse wave, and noise over here. And this one's exactly the same, except on this side we don't have noise, we have our sine wave. And just to explain this a little bit further, or take this a little bit further, we can use this shape selector over here to change this from like analog to ideal. So for example, if we're looking at the triangle wave, we set it to ideal, we get our perfect triangle wave. And then we set it to analog, still sounds like a triangle wave, but it's almost a bit more like a sine wave. And, you know, that just kind of matches how analog synths would create or put out this waveform. It wouldn't be this perfect triangle. And then analog 2 is just another different model. Almost a perfect wave, but it's got this kind of like little bite over here. And that's adding some harmonics, almost like a sawtooth harmonic to it. So just know that you can change these if you want something a bit more dirty, for example. Okay, and then going on to this little button here, this is a sync button, and that just synchronizes the two oscillators. So if we had them at the exact same octave, and then both set them to saw waves, for example, they're kind of now just stacking on top of each other. We take off sync, and now phasing, going in and out of phase because they're not, at the exact same phase. So we can sync up the phase like that. And ideally, if you're using sync, you want to use them on different octaves. Because otherwise you can't really differentiate between the two oscillators. Okay, and then over here we've got some pitch controls. So over here, let's just concentrate on this slider. This controls how these modulate the oscillators. So if I have this set to 1, then both of these controls will be modulating just VCO 1. If I set it to both, then both of these controls will be controlling both of them. Set it to 2, it'll only be controlling oscillator 2, and if I hit split, then this knob will only control this side, and this knob will control this side. So just to show you how that would sound, if we start off on the first one, let's increase this knob. So envelope 2, let's make this like a bit more of a plucky shape. So I'm just going to bring down the sustain here. And I'm going to make this a bit shorter. So you can hear how the pitch is like sweeping from high to low. Okay, and currently this is only set to 1, so it's only doing it to the first oscillator. If I set this all the way to the left, so we're only hearing the first oscillator, we now hear that pitch sweep. We only set it to VCO 2, there's no pitch sweep. That's because this is only set to 1. So if I set it to both, then we'll hear it on both of them and mix together. Okay, then we set it to 2, only hearing it on 2, not hearing it on 1. If I set it to split, then we'll only hear it on 1, not on 2. But if I had to set this to envelope 2 and move that up, then we would hear it on 2. And just to show you how even more how the split would work, let's say I set this to the left, then the pitch would be going from low to high, but it would only be doing it to VCO 2. So if we listen to VCO 2, now it's going up in pitch. But if I set it to VCO 1, because this knob is turned to the right, it's going to go down in pitch. And then those combined, it gets a pretty cool effect because we have one going from high and one going from low. So you can get pretty creative just by messing around with these controls. Okay, and then the cross mod is similar to on our triple VCO, this FM control. So it also is basically frequency modulation, where we have oscillator 2 being modulated by the frequency of oscillator 1. And that gets pretty dirty. And the difference is we can control the modulation using another source. So over here where it says no mod, you can click here, and let's say we wanted to use envelope 2 to control the modulation of this cross mod, then we could do that by increasing this. And you can also control the FM or the cross mod over here using this modulation modification. So on the modification tab, if you increase this, you can control it here. So it's basically just the exact same control, just in 2 places. And then just another thing that I forgot to mention, and that is on the noise oscillator, you have this control over here in the modifications tab. You can basically use it to crossfade between these two oscillators. And that's sometimes desirable because let's say you have this patch here that has noise and a saw wave. But you don't want that noise to be there all the time. You could crossfade between them. So let's use like, use envelope 2 again. And if we just fade this to the right, you'll notice how it kind of starts to get louder, the noise. If I start it on the left, we start with the noise. If I move it to the right, we start with the oscillator 2, so with the saw wave, but it'll eventually sweep down to the noise. Oh, my bad. I have to set this to the center. So because this is set to the center now, it'll move the control to the right and then essentially drag it down to the left. If I increase the decay, there we go, you'll hear how the noise starts to fade in. And then moving it to the left, you would start with the noise oscillator and then you would hear that saw wave fading in. Okay, so that pretty much covers the dual VCO module. Next up, we're going to cover the DCO. Okay, onto our DCO. Alright, so this one is quite a lot more simple. However, according to Diva, this is slightly more complex in terms of the waveforms that it can produce. And you can also get some nice bright sounds out of this one. So let's just start on the left. So similar to the dual VCO, we've got the PW and LFO2 over there. And this is controlling the pulse width. And this is controlling the modulation of the pulse width. So just to gloss over that again, if we look at the scope and we set this to this waveform over here, which is the PWM waveform, this is the only one that is affected by the pulse width. And similarly on this oscillator over here, the fourth one down is also the only one that's the pulse width gets modulated on. So if I increase this, let's just turn down the noise in the sub here, you'll see how this width starts to change. And then we can modulate it with this source, which is LFO tool at the moment. Not LFO tool, LFO2 at the moment. So the thing with this is, while we've got two waveforms, we've only got one oscillator, so we can only control the pitch of one oscillator, and we can't like crossfade between these waveforms. They're either there or they're not. They're in like equal volumes too. So if you wanted to switch one of them off, you would just set it to the top position here, which is that line. Now they're both switched off. No one's on. No one's on. No one's off. And so on. So the transpose is controlling the octave that we're in. Okay, and we've got two different modulation sources, but they're both modulating the same oscillator because there is only one oscillator. So you could, I mean, if you wanted to use them both, you could set one to LFO2 and the other one to envelope 2. Now we have envelope 2 going down in pitch and LFO2 modulating like a vibrato kind of thing. If you wanted to do something like that, maybe with a long decay, you could make a sound like that if you wanted. Okay, so on to the next. I'm just going to reset these back to 0. So here we have our waveforms, which I've kind of already gone over, but just to cover them even further, we've got one pulse wave over here, which is like our basic pulse wave, and then with a slightly shorter pulse width over here, and then here's the one where you can modulate the pulse width using this control. And then on the sawtooth waveform over here, we have our sawtooth over here. Let me just turn this off so that we can hear it. There's our basic sawtooth. And we've got a sawtooth that's got some pulse width to it, so it's kind of like a combination of saw and pulse. And then the fourth one down, we can control the width of that combination using that pulse width knob. Then we've got this one, which is like almost like it's been synced to a higher octave or something. I don't really know. The manual doesn't really explain what this one is, but just know that it sounds like this. And then we've got this one, which is a similar sound to that. Okay, and then moving on, we've got our sub-oscillator, and we can use this to control the volume of the sub-oscillator, and we've got the noise volume over here too. So we can turn up the noise, give the sound some noise, or we can turn this up. And then it starts to add an oscillator that is 1 octave below this. So this is set to 8, this one will be at 16. And there's different shapes. And then these ones, the super wide ones, means that it's 2 oscillators below this point. So if you were in a higher octave, for example, like right now we're getting a nice sub. If we were to go down, that sub is too deep, can't really hear it. So we would go up to this one then. And there we can feel the sub again. Go back up to here. That sub is too high, we go back down to this one. Okay, so that pretty much covers the DCO. This is a nice short one, not very complex, but still capable of making some really cool sounds. On to the next one, which will be dual VCO Eco, and we'll cover that in the next lesson. Okay, so let's have a look at this dual VCO Eco module. Now, I believe the word that they used for this in the manual was primitive. They said it was based on primitive hardware, and it really is quite basic. It's called Eco because of how little CPU it actually uses, and it doesn't have anything fancy like FM or any of those other nice controls. You've got 2 oscillators over here, and you can control the volume of both of them, and the pulse width, then a bit of pitch tuning and the tune mod, and there's nothing else really. But let's just take you through this one by one. So over here, starting on the left, we've got this tune mod, which lets us use different modulation sources to control the pitch of the oscillators. Just one thing you've got to realize about this is that although we've got 2 oscillators, we cannot control the pitch independently. Both of these control like the global pitch of the oscillators. So the pitch, the overall pitch of the combination of these 2 oscillators. So just for example, if I increase the modulation of envelope 2, using envelope 2, this envelope, what you'll notice is that the pitch starts off higher and then sweeps down, just like that. But it affects the global pitch, so we can't separate them. And then likewise with the one below it, it's just using a different source here, LFO2. And it's applied to both of them. Okay, so let me just reset those back to 0. Okay, and then up here we've got some choice of some sound waves. We've got our triangle wave over here, Let me just turn down oscillator 2. That's our triangle, and we've got a saw. And then we've got the pulse wave. And with the pulse wave, we can control the width of it. If I just look at the scope, you'll be able to see that changing. Okay, and then we can control the octave. And we've got a noise oscillator. Okay, so on to oscillator 2, we've got a saw wave, we've got a square wave, then we've got this, basically it's like the shortened pulse width version of the square wave. So it's similar to just taking this one and having that pulse width really short. And then we've got ring, which is basically using or combining the oscillator of oscillator 1 and ring modulating between the square wave and this whatever wave you have selected over here. So if you don't know what ring modulation is, it's basically what they do is they multiply two sound waves together and it basically creates a new sound wave. And it's similar to the sound of it gives you like this sort of like gritty sound, almost like using like a really fast LFO to modulate the amplitude of a sound wave. Yeah, you can read more about it, but you know, once you listen to it, you'll know what it sounds like. So ring modulation sounds like this. So it changes based on whatever oscillator you have selected here. And it also gets affected by like the octave. So even though oscillator 1 now is completely switched off in terms of volume, because we're ring modulating these two waves together, we're still getting the result of oscillator 1 being multiplied by oscillators 2's square wave. So you can get some pretty cool, like gnarly, gritty sounds out of that ring mod. So yeah, I always suggest just testing that out. And then onto the detune here, we can detune oscillator 2 from oscillator 1. So if they're both switched on here, you could make like perfect fifths and stuff. And again, it's the same with this knob. The more you turn it, the higher this knob will jump, going into the next octave. And so on, just like with all the other ones. Okay, and then as you can see, I've been adjusting the volume, so these are just volume knobs. So this is a nice short one over here, very simple, very basic. If you have a really weak PC, you can still get some cool sounds out of this while retaining your CPU health at a nice low number. Thanks for watching, and in the next one we're going to go over this digital oscillator. Okay, so onto the digital oscillator. This one is, it is what it says it is. It's modeled off a digital synth. And I know it's a bit counterintuitive because people usually buy Diva because they want analog sounds. But you can still get some really cool sounds out of this, so I wouldn't discount it. So starting off over to the left, we have this wave over here. And just bear in mind that we've got two oscillators here. These things, they both got the same waveform, so I'm not going to go over both of them. On the left, the only difference between the left and the right is here we have this tune knob, which is just allows us to go up and down in semitones. And this is our octave control. So this controls the octave of the left oscillator, and this controls the fine tuning of the right. Okay, so let's start with the waveforms. On the left we have this multi-saw, which is like essentially like a super saw. And for it to work properly, you have to increase this multi amount, because that blends in the extra saw waves. And then you want to increase the detune. Oh, sorry, I have this selected to the right, so we need to turn it to the left, so we're hearing the left oscillator. I just set these back to where they were. As soon as I increase the multi, you hear the sound kind of thickens up, and then if we increase the detune, it gets even thicker and a bit more detuned. So that's great for like pads and things like that. And then we get onto this triangle tri-wrap, which is essentially, if you look at the little picture over here, you see you've got triangle waves, and you got these like almost like little points coming in underneath and above them. Well, that's what it looks like on the scope too. So if I play this, you'll see we've got, let me just turn this down. We've got almost like you can picture a triangle wave going up and down these, and then almost like another point just peeking in below it and above it. And then as we increase this, that point kind of drags out, and these two lines get close together, and that point comes back in as we reduce it. And you just got to listen to how it sounds to decide whether or not you want to use it. So I think to the right it gives it a bit more of like a hollow sound. To the left it's like almost a bit more sawy. And then the bend just changes like the symmetry of it. So I guess like the theory behind it isn't really important. You just got to get used to, you know, the sounds of the different controls. And then moving on to the noise oscillator. This is like a digital noise, so we can tune it up and down to make it brighter and darker. You can barely even hear it here. And then as we increase the Q is basically like on this EQ8. If I increase this point, the Q would be the width of this point, so the resonance. And if you take some noise and give it some resonance, you can hear that if that's sharp enough, you eventually start getting tones out of the noise. And using this control, you can pretty much get sine waves out of the noise. And you can, it's pretty cool this, because you can make sounds like this, almost sounds like wind going through a tunnel. So yeah, that's a pretty fun one and quite useful in sound design. So on to the next one, we've got this feedback, which is essentially just a saw wave that gets fed back into itself. And that feedback amount is controlled over here with this. And that gives it quite a nice tone. It's almost like this screechy sound. And this tune knob basically just increases the amount of delay with that almost like the feedback delay amount. So yeah, you can get some interesting sounds out of that one. Then we've got the pulse, which has some pulse width modulation over here. I've seen that before on other synths. And then the spike up basically starts blending in a saw wave. So we've basically got a saw wave over there. The higher it goes, like it almost sounds like it's going up like an octave. And then we've got this triangle. Is it a triangle? Sorry, this is the saw. And that's a saw combined with a sine wave. And they are synchronized, I believe. Yeah, synchronized. And we can increase, so this basically just changes the polarity and the amount. So as I increase it, you'll watch this curve starts to bend down into this direction, and this one goes up into that direction. And you just get like slightly different characteristics from that. If we adjust this carefully, we can almost get like a sine wave tone out of it. This is just changing like the symmetry, horizontal symmetry. And then similar to this, we've got almost exactly the same thing as the saw. It's just with a triangle. And the only difference is that the triangle being blended with the sine wave, the sine wave in this case is 1 octave higher. In this case, it's at the same octave. So there you can see the sine wave coming in. So yeah, some very interesting sounds that you can get out of this oscillator. Then the right is pretty much exactly the same thing. The only difference is we got this tune, which is controlling the, if I mix them together, that's controlling the fine tune. And then we've also got the sync, which synchronizes the waves together. Okay, and then over here on the left, we've got envelope 2 tune mode. And we can change this to whatever modulation we want. So for example, if we use LFO, then we're going to be changing the tune of the entire global pitch. And then we've got this cross over here, which is essentially just the like the FM. So we FMing oscillator 2 to oscillator 1. And then ring modulation is just ring modulating these two waves together. You can get some cool sounds out of that. And then down in the middle we have some more modulation sources and options. This is again pitch modulation, just like this one, except that's global and we can use this to control these two separately. However, we can't control them like individually at different amounts because we've only got one knob over here. So we can do either the right or the left or both, but we can't separate them and do them, for example, the left one pitching from down to up and the right one pitching from up to down, just because we have only one knob. Okay, then over here we have the modulation depth, the pulse width modulation depth. So if you have it set to the pulse wave, you can start to modulate that pulse width. And then below that we've got the shape depth. And that's just changing like the waveform shapes over here, so it's essentially sweeping up and down. And I believe that uses quite a lot of CPU, so just be careful with that. So if we set that to LFO 2, just have to switch this on, obviously. So that pretty much covers everything. Oh, there's one more thing here. Sorry, this is high quality or low quality. High quality, as you can read in the little LED display that just turns on this digital anti-alias function, which reduces the aliasing and just makes it higher quality, and that comes at the cost of using more CPU. So if you're struggling with CPU, turning this off, might give a bit less quality, but it'll help your CPU. Okay, so that pretty much covers the digital oscillator, and that's all of our oscillators covered. So now you should know everything there is to know about all these different models. Next up, what we're going to be covering are these feedback and high-pass filters models over here. So thanks for watching. I hope you learned a thing or two, and we'll catch you at the next one. Okay, we now get into the next panel, the next module, which, if you have a look at this triple VCO, it actually comes with a mixer. And if you compare it to the rest of the other ones, they come with like swappable modules over here. So we can choose from a high-pass filter or just feedback to high-pass filter post, high-pass filter pre, and high-pass filter byte. But there's no mixer here. And just like with the triple VCO, if we go into mixer and we click it here, as soon as we select any one of these, it's going to give us the same menu as this. And that's because on this oscillator, or this triple VCO, there is no option to swap these out. So if you want to swap these out, you're going to have to use a different oscillator model. Okay, so let's just set it to dual VCO, and then we can start going through these different modules. Okay, so the first one is just feedback, no high-pass filter. So it's simple, simply just a feedback knob. And I've already explained feedback before, but it basically works by taking the signal output and basically feeding it back into the mixer. And it has the effect of creating like subharmonics and these like low howling sounds. Just to demonstrate. Yeah, in this case, it's created like really, well, basically boosted the sub. So that's that one. Then next up we have the high-pass filter post. And the reason why it's called post is because even though it's placed here before this filter, it actually comes after that in the signal chain. So the signal will be going from the oscillator into this filter, this VCF cascade, and then into this high-pass filter post. And the dial is basically just a few preset amounts. The boost actually boosts the sub-frequencies. It's a very subtle boost, but if you look at my EQ8, you can watch this little harmonic goes up in volume. And then as we set this higher, it reduces the sub. Okay, the next up is high-pass filter pre, and that comes before the other VCF. And that's quite a noticeable high-pass filter, and you'll see what it does over here. It's quite a gradual slope, but it moves up quite high. Okay, then the next module, HPF byte, is basically like a complete high-pass filter that has its own resonance, which is called peak here, and some modulation too, and then just another thing called rev, which is essentially like another, almost like a model. So it just has slightly different characteristics. So if I turn up this filter, you'll be able to hear it. And then we turn up the peak, it'll add some resonance. You can see it sweeping up and down there. And then you can add this modulation, so it's being modulated by envelope 1. Let's add it to like maybe LFO 2, just so that we can hear it wobbling up and down. And then if you want to listen to these, I don't think you'll really be able to hear much of a difference. Oh, actually it is quite a difference. So it seems like the resonance is quite a lot higher on 2. Okay, and that basically covers it for this module. In the next video we're going to get into the VCF. Okay, so we now move on to the VCF section. Okay, so for this part of the module I'm just going to set this to the mini mono, or let's use the mini poly, and that way we start off with the basic VCF ladder filter, and we can explain it quite easily using this preset. Okay, so this is based off the Moog filter, the ladder filter, and starting off right at the top is the cutoff. And if we just pull that down, that's going to basically start cutting out the higher frequencies. I'm just going to set this to a lower octave because it's easier to explain stuff when we've got a full spectrum of frequencies here. Okay, so firstly, yeah, so the cutoff, we can set that wherever we want. And you can hear that sounds really nice, like it's got a really nice growl to it. And then we can switch this between 12 and 24 dB. At the moment it's set to 24 dB, which is a bit steeper. If I click this, you'll see more harmonics pop through. And then we get into these modulation sources. So here we can modulate the cutoff. These both modulate the cutoff using whatever we want here. So at the moment it's set to envelope 2. If I increase this, because of the shape of envelope 2, we've got a low sustain, and the decay is up here, and a low attack. What's happening is the filter's opening and then closing. If I lengthen the attack, you'll hear it open. Bring down that decay, we'll hear it happen even quicker. So it's really important that you understand how envelopes work together with filters in order to create certain sounds. Because once you've got the hang of that, you can really start, making your own sounds, and just that's your basic foundation of sound design that you need to know. Okay, and then getting onto this side, we've got another modulation source. So let's say we have this, and we want to do even more filter modulation. We can select something else. At the moment, LFO 2. And if we increase the rate of LFO 2, you'll be able to hear it more. So that's pretty fun. And then we've got the emphasis, which is basically your resonance amount. And then we've got keyboard tracking. So basically how this works is if we turn it up, lower notes, the filter will be closed, more closed, and then the higher the note is that you play on your keyboard, the more open the filter becomes. If I just disable that. So at the moment we're playing a low key. And you'll notice that if I play something a lot higher, we're getting a lot more frequencies through. If I turn this keyboard tracking off, it's now quite a lot darker. So keyboard tracking can work really nice on things like arpeggios that are like spanning multiple octaves. Sometimes you have a problem where you're only really hearing the bottom note of the arpeggio because the filter's like really closed. In those cases, enabling keyboard tracking would ensure that, you know, notes that are higher up will be a bit brighter and come through a little bit more. And then we get this FM OSC1, and that's basically just using FM on the cutoff, on the filter cutoff. So basically controlling this cutoff using the rate of, or the frequency of oscillator 1. And what this does is just gives it, you know, a bit more grit. A bit more growl, so you can, if you want to make sounds like, you know, bite a little bit more, then consider using FM, this FM knob over here. Okay, so the cascade filter is quite similar to the ladder filter in terms of features. The only difference really is that it has this rough and clean switch, and that basically just changes the character of the sound. Pretty self-explanatory, you know. Rough will be a little bit dirtier. I mean, you can barely hear the difference. And then we've got this 12 dB switch over here, and that basically switches it between 12 and 24 dB, just like on the ladder filter where we're switching it over here. Cascade filter does a similar thing. And according to the manual, this ladder filter is a little bit, the cascade filter is a little bit better for things like pads. It's just a little bit smoother. It doesn't have quite as much grunge to it as the ladder filter. I mean, for the most part, it sounds almost the same to me. Yeah. So moving on, we're going to the multi-mode filter. And the multi-mode filter is again quite similar in terms of controls. You know, we've got the cutoff, the resonance, the key tracking, the envelope amounts, controlling the cutoff, and the FM. But it does offer a few more options here. We've got low pass 4, which is the 24 dB filter, low pass filter. The MP2, which is the 12 dB, which both the other filters did have. The only thing that this adds is it's got a high pass and a band pass filter. So the high pass obviously removes low frequencies, as you can see. And the band pass cuts off low and high frequencies. Okay, so that is pretty simple. And then we can get on to the next one, which is bite. Okay, so again, we've got similar controls. We've got the cutoff on this one. We've got keyboard tracking, peak, which is our resonance amount. And then we've got our modulation and we've got our FM. But this filter varies quite drastically in terms of character compared to the other ones. And this depends highly on the input level of the signal that's going into the filter. So if you are busy working on a sound and you decide to use this bite filter, you probably want to be playing quite a lot with the peak. And then just messing around with these volumes over here and seeing, you know, what sort of sounds you're getting. You know, going a lot higher will give you a lot different character, and also selecting these different rev versions basically will also change the character. You can immediately hear that. This one sounds a bit bassier, it's a bit louder. And that resonance can really like almost scream. Yeah, so that filter is pretty cool. But again, it's not very different in terms of controls. Generally, if you know one of these filters, you'll be able to figure out the rest of them. Okay, so on to the next one, which is this UB. Okay, so the UB filter is, again, quite similar in terms of controls to the rest. We've got the cutoff, resonance, and then we've got like the envelope amounts here for controlling the cutoff. And keyboard tracking, just like with the other ones, FM. And the only real difference is here we've got this morph, which basically morphs from a low pass through to whatever you select here, through to a high pass. And this selector is BR and BP. That's band reject, which is like a notch filter, which looks like this. This is a notch filter. Basically notches out an entire portion of wherever you select. And you can switch it to BP, which is band pass, which looks like... where's our band pass? Band pass will look something like this. Remove lows, remove highs. That's what a band pass looks like. So if we select it to BR, band reject, the filter is going to morph based on this source, LFO2. We're going to have it morphing now between low pass, or if I have it selected to the left here, low pass through here up to high pass, so through band reject to high pass. So it's a very weird kind of sound, but you can get some cool sounds. I'd imagine that you could use something like this on pads too. You know, if you have you know, a big lush pad and you have the filter constantly sweeping around and moving, and then you have some delays and reverbs after that, it'll make it like really dynamic and interesting. So yeah, this is a really cool filter and something that could net some really interesting dynamic sounds. And that's it pretty much for the filters. Next up, we're going to get into the envelopes. Okay, so onto the envelope sections. All I've done here is I've just gone back to presets, to the templates here, and enabled the mini poly again, so that I've just reset the patch. And I expect before we get started that you already have an understanding of envelopes and how they work. And if you don't, I would recommend pausing the video and just reading up on them, maybe playing with them for a while and just getting an understanding of them. Okay, so the first envelope we're looking at is this ADS envelope. It has an attack, decay, and sustain stage, and then the release is shared with the decay in terms of time. So if we switch on this release, we will have a the decay will match the release, or rather the release time will match the decay, depending on how long you set this. So just to show you how that works, if I make a short MIDI note here, and turn this off, you'll hear it cuts off. If I turn on the release, we have a longer release. If I increase the decay time, the release also gets longer. And that can get pretty messy. Notes will start to like overlap with each other, but you can get some really cool sounds with that. And then we have this velocity, which basically increases the amplitude of this envelope. Basically scales it according to the velocity of the note. So if we have a low velocity, we can't even really hear it. A bit higher. So if you wanted to like play this in and then have varying velocities, you could make something like nice and dynamic with that velocity dial. And that control just scales it. So if you want the velocity to not be affected too much, then you could just dial that down. And then it wouldn't be so drastic. And then keyboard tracking basically scales up the time, or scales down the timing of the decay and the release, based on where the note is played. So in higher octaves it'll be shorter, and in lower octaves it'll be longer. So just to show that to you, we have a nice long note here. I'm going to bring down the sustain so we have a plucky sound. I'm going to give it a bit of sustain and give it a bit of release, so you can hear the release. And then we'll just put this up like a couple octaves, and then you can hear how the decay and the release shortens. If I bring down the sustain so that you can hear the full decay, then you'll notice it gets shorter and shorter as we go higher. If I go back down, it gets longer. Okay, so that's the keyboard tracking, and that's pretty much it for the ADS envelope. Next up is this analog envelope, and that is just modeled off another popular synth. Basically, if you want to know why to use different envelopes, because as you can see the controls are pretty much the same, other than this release stage being independently controllable compared to this one, which is controlled by the decay. If you want to know why to use these, you should just test them out and listen to them, because these decays, basically the shape of the envelope, the curve, could be exponential, it could be linear, but they just know that they do vary, and you will get different sounds out of them based on those curves. So like a plucky sound in this might sound different to a plucky sound in this. You know, you have to fiddle with it and see what sounds good. And then it's also got the scaling, the velocity in the keyboard, just like in the other one. And then we've got the digital envelope, and that's the same as our previous one. The only difference is it has this quantize and curve toggle, and these just basically affect the, I think essentially the shape or the curve of the envelope. The quantize is just a bit more like robotic and steppy, and the curve is just a bit more smoother. But in listening to them, you don't really hear. You don't really hear much of a difference. Okay, and then below this envelope, we have another envelope with just identical options here. And all you need to know is that you've got two envelopes, and you can use them for separate things. Like, for instance, this is your amp envelope, you can modulate the shape of the sound, or the amplitude of the sound, and then you can use envelope 2 and map it to the cutoff, for example. So that's why we've got two envelopes, because we want to modulate separate things with separate envelopes. Okay, so next up we're going to be going into LFO and the rest of the panels down here. Thanks for watching this section, and I'll catch you in the next one. Okay, so onto the LFO section. I'm just going to reset the preset to this mini poly, and then I'm just going to turn down the second oscillator so we're only hearing the first one. And I'm going to assign the LFO, the first LFO, to the tuning so that we can hear what all the effects are doing. So I'll just turn that on and then change this to LFO1. Okay, so if you don't know what an LFO is, I think you should just go and look it up before we get into this so that you know what I'm talking about. But just to give a very brief overview, an LFO is essentially just a really slow oscillator, and we use it to modulate things in the same way that we would use an envelope to modulate things. So we can assign it to our filter cutoff, for example, or to the tuning, which I've done over here. So increasing this tuning amount, we will hear the LFO starts to bend the pitch up and down, up and down. But in order for us to hear it, we just have to increase the amount first of all, and make sure that this depth mod is at any value other than 100 over here, because 100 we won't hear anything. Bring it down, we start to hear it. Okay, so we've got the LFO assigned to the tuning. Let's start having a look at everything. So starting here, we've got different waveforms. We've got sine, triangle, saw up, saw down, which is just it's pretty self-explanatory. We've got a saw wave that starts at a negative value and ends at a positive value. Saw down starts high, goes low, and then the same with the square, high, low, and low, high. Random and hold is just essentially a random LFO. It's constantly changing and it's completely random. And it's kind of like very jumpy and sudden. But you can also use random glide, which glides between the values instead of jumping around. Then we've got gate. We've got this restart, which essentially tells the synth when to restart the LFO. If we set it to sync, the LFO is going to synchronize with our project, and essentially it will, play at the exact same rate in time. So it'll, like, let's say you play it over here and you play it over here and go back to here. It's going to sound exactly the same every time, depending on where you are in the project. And then we can change it to gate, which causes it to reset every time we hit a note. So you can hear it's resetting every time. Okay, and then we have this single, which basically means that, like, let's say we played 2 notes in succession. It's going to cause the LFO not to reset, even though I've played 2 notes at separate times. Well, I'm holding down one and then adding another note. The LFO just keeps going, even though I've hit the other note. Whereas with this gate, we now get a separate LFO on the newly added note. So I'm holding down a note and then I add another one. You'll hear that LFO then applies a separate tuning to that new note. And they aren't synchronized with each other, whereas with the single, it treats both notes with the same LFO. No matter when I hit that second note, it's always going to be using that same LFO. Okay, and then we have random, which basically just resets it randomly completely different times every time. that's random. Okay, so then on to sync. So this just sets the time that it takes for the LFO to go through a complete cycle. The moment it's set to 1 second, you can change it to like 16th notes, for example. And there's a bunch of different timings here, triplets. So I'll leave that on 8th notes for now, so that we can explain how rate works. So rate basically depends on sync to determine the speed of the LFO. At its default position, which is 12 o'clock, the rate doesn't do anything. It's set to 0 if you look at the LED. If I drag it to the left and you watch the LED, it changes to a negative value. To the right, changes to a positive value. So if I take that to the left, all it's going to do is basically slow down the LFO from an 8th note. So at the moment it's an 8th note, bring it down, it's slower than an 8th note. Speed it up, it's faster than an 8th note. Okay, so next up is the rate mod. So the rate mod, we can assign essentially modifier to the rate, which is, we can use like, let's say velocity, for example. If I set this to a positive value, the higher the velocity is, the faster the rate will go. So at the moment it's at its maximum, so it's going to be a bit faster than the, it's going to be essentially like turning the rate to here. And then if I bring it down to 0, and we get it back to 8th notes. If I make that a negative value, then when we increase it, it's going to go slower. Okay, and you can assign that to a bunch of different parameters, up to you. Okay, and then we have polarity, which basically, if you don't understand polarity, I think the best way to show it to you would be in a different synth called Serum. So let me just open that up quickly. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign this LFO to our filter in Serum. You don't really need to understand what you're seeing here, just focus on what I'm talking about. So if I drag the LFO into the cutoff, it's going to now move the filter up and down based on this LFO. And if you look at this little point, it's basically following the shape of the LFO. Okay, so looking at this little white line, we can see that that's at the center. And this little point is moving behind and in front of it. And I can decrease that. And then if I switch, so that's called bipolar, meaning it's moving negative and positive values. If I Alt Shift and click this, it then changes to unipolar, where it's only moving positive values. So the LFO is going to sound, oh, the cutoff is going to go higher, but it's not going to go lower. Change it back to bipolar, we're getting the value going negative again. So I think, yeah, this really helped me to understand it when I was first learning, just because it's nice and visual. So hopefully that's helped you understand unipolar and bipolar. So just know that on this synth, when polarity is enabled, it's set, you can see in the LED display it says positive, so that's unipolar, and then bipolar is when it's switched off. Okay, and then let's just look at this depth mod. So the depth mod, as I explained in the beginning, if it's set to 100%, you won't hear the LFO. And then at 0, you hear it at its fullest. And you can assign this amount to whatever parameter you want. So if I assign it to velocity, and then set it to Well, at the moment our velocity is at 100% when I'm hitting a key, but let me show you with the MIDI note. If we bring down this velocity, we are barely hearing at all because the velocity is very low and this is set to 100, so the needle's just moving up slightly. If I move that up to 100%, then we're hearing it at its fullest, halfway, a little bit less, and that's how that works. Okay, and that's by default set to the mod wheel, so you know, if you're playing your keyboard you can give yourself some vibrato using the mod wheel. Alright, so the only thing we haven't covered here is the phase and the delay. So phase just determines where in the LFO the cycle is starting, and by increasing it you can get like a slightly different start to the sound, and I think the best way to understand it is to just hear it. So at the moment you can hear that it's kind of starting at 0 and then going up. Let me make this a lot slower so that you can understand it. So it's starting low and going high, but if I increase this phase, I could start it at a higher point. Yeah, so that's the best way to explain phase. You can also visualize it here in Serum, the phase over here. The moment it's starting, like over there at 0, I play a note. But if we change the phase, essentially it would cause the start of the note to be like over here, for example, instead of starting over there. I don't think you can actually change phase in Serum, which is very strange. Yeah. Okay. So then moving on to delay. The delay just dictates the amount of time it takes for the LFO to fade in. So if I increase this, sorry. What you'll notice is that you don't hear it for a while. Oh, let me just increase the speed so that we can hear it nicely. So there you can see it's faded in, and the higher you put this knob, the longer it'll take to fade in. So that's pretty cool on things like leads where you're adding vibrato, and you don't want the start of the note to have that vibrato, but you want, you know, it to fade in, almost like how a violinist would play a violin. When they hold the note, they only start to add that vibrato after, you know, a few milliseconds. The LFO1, you can see in brackets it says vibrato, so that's by default assigned to this vibrato knob over here, and if you don't have it assigned to anything else on the synth, just know that if you increase this, as long as the depth mod is at 0 or below 100, you will start to get some vibrato. Okay, and LFO2 by default is assigned to shape mod, but you can assign it to whatever you want. Here it's also assigned to the cutoff. And there's no real difference between the controls on these. They all do the same thing. So you've got 2 LFOs, and just like you've got 2 envelopes. So it just gives you a bit more control, a bit more options. Okay, so next up we're getting into the tuning and the rest of the panels. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next section. Okay, so onto the tuning section. We've got vibrato, which basically just controls the amount of vibrato linked to this LFO1. So as long as the depth mod is below 100, we'll be able to hear the vibrato as we increase this. Okay, then we've got glide, which is basically just the portamento or the pitch bend between notes. So if I increase this and play another note, a higher note, you'll hear that glide increases. It gets longer over time. And then glide 2 basically offsets oscillators 2's glide. So at the moment, oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 are gliding together. Glide 2 will make it so they kind of glide out of time. They eventually end up at the same pitch, but you have them kind of offset. And a nice way to see this is if you're looking at an EQ, you can, if you look at the this fundamental here, you can watch how we suddenly get two fundamentals bending eventually into time. Okay, and then the range determines basically the amount of pitch bend. So if we have two notes over here, for example, these are 2 octaves apart. If the range is set to 100, it's going to bend from this note to that note. But if I set the range to 50, when this note plays, the pitch bend is only going to start halfway between the two. So essentially you get less of a bend. And then if you set that to 0, you will have no pitch bending. Okay. So that covers range. I'm just going to turn this glide off again. Oh, actually, we got one more thing to explain with glide, and that is the rate, or the glide mode. Okay, so the glide mode, basically time means that whenever no matter how far apart notes are, the amount of time it takes for them to glide will never change. It'll always be the same. But if you set it to rate, then notes that are further apart will start to glide slower and slower the further apart they get. Okay, and then fine tuning, that just basically controls the master pitch. And that's pretty handy for things like FM. So if I play a note, let me just... If I use FM, and if we look at the tuning here, on this tuner, currently we're playing a C, but if I increase the FM amount, that starts to take it out of tune. So what if I like the way that this is pulsating and I want to use it, but the problem is it's out of tune? Well, now we can use fine tune to bring it back into tune. So now we got the effect of FM that we like, and the tuner has taken it back into tune. Okay, so that's what fine tune is handy for. And then transpose will just change basically the octave or note that you're starting at. So at the moment it's at 0, so if we change that to 12, we would be then playing 1 octave higher. Let me just turn off this glide. Change it to 0, then we playing lower, and then we can go all the way down to the sub. And then this up and down just controls the pitch bending amount. So at the moment, if you had to use your pitch bend wheel on your keyboard to bend the pitch, it'll only go up and down 2 semitones, but you can change that and increase the amount of pitch bend. Then micro tuning is a topic all on its own. If you want to understand it yourself, I'd recommend watching this video that I have loaded over here. It's microtonality in Western music, and that explains it pretty well. But just know that you can load different files that basically allow you to play different scales on your keyboard aside from the standard chromatic, 12 notes or 12 semitone scale that we have in Western music. So you can use that to load the files and then switch micro tuning on. Okay, so that's it for the tuning. Next up, we'll have a look at the amp and the pan. Okay, so onto amplifier and pan. Pretty simple little section over here. We've got this VCA, which we can either, our VCA stands for voltage control amplifier, which means basically at the moment it's set to envelope 1, so envelope 1 is controlling the amp. So that's why when you adjust this envelope, the shape of the sound changes. And so on. And you can use either envelope 1 or just a gate, and then that frees up envelope 1 to be used elsewhere. So if it's set to gate, this envelope no longer changes the shape of the sound. Now it's just a simple straight sustained sound. You know, and the gate just means that as soon as it receives MIDI, sound will either be on or off. Okay, and then going into the volume control, this is just our volume, similar to what we have here, output, but the difference is that this is the amplifier, so it has some basically modeled circuitry in it. So what happens if you turn it up is it starts to almost overdrive the volume, and you'll start to get like a bit of, you know, subtle overdriven warmth to it. So you can use that if you're looking to change the warmth of the sound. Turning up the volume over here will do that. If you want it to be completely transparent, then you use the output volume over here. Then pan just pans it left and right. And then we get this volume mod, and we can use like an LFO or something to play with the volume. And then we get pan mod, which does similar to this. We can pan stuff left and right using a modifier, or modulator. And then another little tip with this is if you have like a big stack of saw waves or whatever, you can use stack index with pan to create like a thicker, wider sound. So if you're using more than one stack, there we go. So now you can make a wide sound. And the more stacks you use, the wider and thicker the sound becomes. This is just basically panning all the little voices around. Okay. So that's it for Amplifier Pan, and I'll catch you in the next one where we're going to go over the rest of the panels. Okay, so onto the voice section. We're just going to start over here with this little panel. This is our voice section. It doesn't have a label, but this is where you control all the voicings. We have our mode, which is where we select our poly or mono or whatever. The difference between these is poly, you can play more than one note at the same time. So we can make chords and stuff out of this. And with mono, we can only play one note at a time. And it will choose the note basically with the lowest pitch based on the priority here set to lowest. Or if you set it to the highest, it's now only playing that high E over there. And last would just be the last played note. Okay. And then we go down to legato, which basically means that when notes are played in succession. So if I make this into like a plucky envelope, then play two notes in a row, you can hear how they kind of reset. But if you make them overlap, like two different notes, you're not hearing that second one, and that's because the envelope's not resetting. So the envelope resets when we're on monophonic, but not on legato. And then when we go to duo, basically it splits the voices between two oscillators. So you'll need to be using a model that has two oscillators. And then the second oscillator, first oscillator plays the lowest note, the second one will play the highest note. And if you add a note in the middle, it won't play that because it only plays the lowest and the highest. Okay, and then lastly we got poly 2, and with poly 2 it's similar to polyphonic. The difference between poly 2 and polyphonic is that the release tails get cut off on poly 2 when the notes overlap. So if I add some release to this sound, and we play two notes one after the other, let me just put them there. You'll hear the release from this one gets cut off as soon as that one hits. Whereas with normal poly, the release will overlap. So listen to this. Gets cut off. There the release overlaps. So that can get pretty messy. So if you have a messy sound, with like an arpeggiator with release, for example, and you don't want the release tails to overlap because it's getting a bit crazy, then you can try setting it to this poly 2. And that'll clean it up. Okay, so that covers the modes, and we've just covered the priorities. Then the accuracy is basically like the quality of the sound. So if you go up in quality, you obviously use a lot more CPU, but you can immediately hear the quality of the sound changing. You can hear how like buzzy that is, and compared to this. So yeah, if you are making big lush pads with tons of voices and stuff and your CPU is dying, just make sure you've got it on the lowest setting. And then what you can do over here is, it says offline ACC, and that's the offline accuracy, so that when the song gets rendered out, it uses the best quality, which would be divine. Or you can set it to the same, so it'll sound the same. If you have it like on draft and same, then they're both going to be like low quality. If you have it on draft to say save CPU while you're working, you can set it to best when you render. And then the song will get rendered on the highest quality, but while you're working, it'll be on the lowest quality. So you save CPU, but you still get that quality. And then we get onto voices, and this is just the number of voices that can be put out by the synth. So at the moment it's set to 6, so let's say we had it on 2 and on poly. Then it wouldn't be able to put out like a 3-note chord properly. It would start stealing notes from other voices, would start stealing other voices. So you can have like a maximum of 16 voices, and then you can play like huge giant chords. Obviously it uses more CPU the more voices you have. And then you have stack, which is basically your unison. And we had a look at stack briefly when we were looking at the tuning with this pan mod. Remember, if you set it to stack index, then we have like basically a bunch of unison, but that's all centered, and you wanted to like pan it out to make it a wide, thick, like super saw, then you could use this pan mod with stack index and a stack number over there. And it gets a bit thicker over there. Okay, so that's it for the voices. Next up, we're going to have a look at the clock and the arpeggiator. Okay, so onto the clock and arpeggiator section. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw some MIDI notes here quickly. Oh, that's very loud. Let's turn that down. Let me take off some of that cutoff filter. So I'm just going to draw like a big A minor chord. Okay, so if we look at the clock section, this basically determines the speed of the arpeggiator, which is synchronized to your host tempo. So at the moment I'm on 120 BPM, and so that's going to be playing eighth notes. And you can't change the time of that. You can't change it to like milliseconds or seconds or whatever. It's only synchronized. So multiply will scale basically the clock from half as long if you drag it to the left to twice as long to the right. So if I just turn on the arpeggio, then we'll hear it. So that's eighth notes, then this is twice as fast. And this is half as fast. Just want to change the sound a bit to work with, be a bit nicer. Okay, and then we get swing, and with swing we can turn it up to halfway, which makes it triplets. And all the way makes it dotted notes. Okay, and then over here we've got the ARP switch, which just turns the ARP off and on. And then we have the mode, which is basically how the ARP gets played. So played will just play them in the order that you play the notes, essentially. So if I had to spread these out, now it's going to play it in this order. So bottom notes, then this note, then this note. If I had to drag this one out so that that's the last note played, then it'll play like that one, then that one, then that one. And then we have up, which just plays up, and then down plays down, up, down, +1, just basically plays it all the way up and then plays the next note down. Up, down 2 plays it all the way up and then another 2 notes down. Okay, and then random just plays completely random notes. Okay, and then we have octaves. So here we can choose the amount of octaves that the arpeggiator will span, and we can control this by controlling the progression here. So serial will play the first 3 notes and then play the next 3 notes an octave up. And then round will play the first 3, then it'll play an octave up and then an octave down again. I think I need to make this a longer arpeggiator for you to actually hear that. So I'm just going to lengthen this and then drag these out. Okay, so that's round, and then leap. So that is going to play each note in a different octave. And then obviously the more octaves you add here, the more it's going to jump around. Okay, so that covers that, and then repeat. Okay, so repeat works by basically playing each note in all the octaves before it plays the next one. So we have 2 octaves here. It's going to play A over here, then A over here again, and then it's going to play E over here, then E higher up, and then C 1 octave up. Okay, and then restart just determines when the arpeggiator restarts based on notes. So over here it'll be after 4 notes, the arpeggiator will restart. So if we have this on 1 octave here and we set it to, let's say, up, down 2, and maybe set it to like 16th notes, then it's restarting after every 4 notes. If we change this to 8, we get a different pattern. Okay, so that's it for the arpeggiator and clock section. Next up, we're going to cover the effects. Okay, so onto the effects. First up, we've got chorus. So this is the on-off switch, and this is our selector, so we're going to just select chorus. So here we have some types, and these just change basically the character of the chorus. The classic chorus sounds like this. Then we have dramatic, which is just like almost like a bit more detuned. And then ensemble, which is meant for more like almost like string sounding section. So if you have like a pad, using the ensemble might sound good on that. Okay, and then the rate just determines basically the speed of the modulation. So the higher the rate, the faster it modulates. And it also tends to start sounding a bit more detuned. And then like slow rate for like really slow stereo effects. So next up is the depth, and that just controls basically how deep the modulation is. So you'll hear more of an effect at a higher amount and less of a stereo effect at lower depths. And then it's just the dry wet over here, so we hear the dry signal when this is turned all the way to the left. And as we mix it in, we start mixing in the chorus. Okay, that's it for chorus. Next up is phaser. Okay, so the next effect is the phaser, and I'll just reset that. Okay, so we have again the on-off switch, and then we have the type. We have stoned and flanged. This flange type is just basically a bit more resonant. So if I turn it up, and play them, you can hear the it's just a slightly bit more resonant. Okay, let me just reset those controls. Then in terms of the knobs, we have rate and beats. So the rate just increases the speed. And if you hit the sync button, it's going to synchronize it to basically the clock. So you'll start syncing it to notes or beats instead of just using hertz to set the speed of the LFO. And then we have depth, which is basically, you know, how strong the effect is. Depth all the way to the left, you're barely hearing the effect. Then LFO phase basically sets the starting point of the LFO. You won't really notice much of a difference unless you have like a really slow rate. And then we've got the dry wet. And then center. Okay, so center basically controls the volume of the mid signal as compared to the side signal. So as we turn it down, it basically gets a bit wider, turning it up a bit more centered. Then feedback. So this one you'll probably use quite a lot if you're using a phaser, because it makes the sound a lot more obvious. So if I turn this up, you can start to get some pretty cool like flangey effects in there. That basically just feeds the signal back in through the effect and creates like a feedback loop. Okay, then stereo does what it says it does, just makes it more stereo. And that's it for the phaser. Okay, next up is the plate reverb. Okay, starting from the left, we've got the pre-delay, which basically just tells the delay to wait a certain amount of time before it fades in. And that's just so that you can have like a nice dry transient. Okay, and then we have diffusion, which basically what it does is it adds like a chorusy kind of effect to reduce them like harsh metallic resonances in the plate. So if you take that off, it'll probably get a bit brighter and a bit harsher. So yeah, you start to hear those like, it almost becomes like a delay. Then we have dampening, and this is like basically it causes the higher frequencies to almost decay quicker than the lower frequencies. So it'll make it like a bit more of a darker reverb if you have it turned up. Turn it down, it becomes brighter. Okay, and then we have our decay, which is the length of the reverb. And the size is basically the room size, if you will. So it can make it like seem very far away, or a small size can make it feel like you're in this really small room and the reflections are all really close. Okay, then we just have the dry and the wet signal, which are split independently here. So instead of having a dry-wet, you can control the dry and wet separately, almost like you would with a return track. You can have the dry signal up full volume and then just slowly mix in the wet. Okay, so that's the plate reverb, and then onto the delay. So the delay, we start off on the left, we have left, center, and right, which are basically just the delay times. And these are relative to the host tempo. So I can just adjust those. Make them longer and shorter, etc. Okay, then the wow control. This is made to emulate like the like subtle, almost like the pitch drift you get from tape machines. It's kind of hard to hear it. Yeah, so if you really turn it up, you can start to hear it, but it's not a super noticeable effect. And then we have feedback, and that's just basically, you know, if you increase the feedback, you're going to get more delays out of it. So if you want your delay to like ring out longer and almost like echo more times, then you increase the feedback. And you must just be careful, because if the feedback's at maximum, it'll almost like ring out indefinitely. So just don't set it too high, unless you're doing some crazy sound design stuff. Okay, then we have a low pass and a high pass filter, pretty self-explanatory. That's just going to reduce the high frequencies. this will reduce the low frequencies. And then we have our dry wet knob, so that's almost like your mix knob. Then we have our volume controls. We can control the center delay independently to the side delay. We turn up the sides, and then down, turn up the center. Cool, so that's a pretty cool delay. Next up we're going to be doing the Rotary, which is a very unique distortion cabinet. Okay, so next up we're looking at the Rotary. Now for this sound I'm going to make a bass patch just because I feel like Rotary always works really well on bass sounds. It gives it a really nice distortion and character. So we're just playing this note at A2. I'm just going to bring that range down on the octave so that we can have a bass sound. Bring down the cutoff. Turn up the envelope too. And then I'm going to enable Rotary. We switch that on. And you'll immediately be able to tell the effect it's having. It's changing it quite a lot. Okay, so starting off on the left, we've got the mix knob, so that's just controlling the wetness of it. All the way to the left we get no effect, to the right we get full effect. Output is controlling the volume of the signal going out of the effect. Then stereo, we can make it the sound more stereo by having it all the way to the right. Basically what the effect is, the Rotary effect, is it's based off this speaker called a Leslie speaker. And it's basically two speakers inside a cabinet. We have like almost like a tweeter high for the higher signals, and then another bigger cone for the lower signals. And they have these horns that rotate on them, and it creates a really unique sound. So if you basically with the stereo effect, you basically start to separate the mics that are placed in front of these cones, and that creates like an effect of this stereo sound. So all the way to the left, it's a very mono sound. Turn it right, nice and stereo. Then the balance controls the volume levels between each one of those speaker cones. So if you turn it to the right, we start to only really hear the bass speaker, or we hear more of the bass speaker. To the left, we start to get that higher speaker in more, and that speaker has like quite a lot more bite if you pay attention to it. So if you're after that nice bite, then make sure that you turn that balance a bit more to the left. Okay, then we get on to these slow and fast controls and the rise time. And that basically just controls the speed of the rotation on each one of those cones. And you can control basically the time it takes for that rotation to reach its speed using the rise time, which is assigned to this controller. So it's all a bit confusing, but just know that at the moment the controller is assigned to the mod wheel, and my mod wheel on my keyboard is currently all the way down. So we would only be hearing this slow parameter. So let me just play that. So there you can hear the rotation of that low speaker really speeding up over there. And we don't hear anything with this fast control, because the mod wheel's all the way at the bottom. Okay, so if I turn that up now we start to hear the fast control. Okay, and we're not hearing the slow one anymore. So if we have that in the center, then we can hear them independently, or you can hear them together. And we can start to get some really cool sounds out of that. And the rise time basically just controls basically the speed with which they rise when we use the mod wheel. So if you had to suddenly turn up your mod wheel really quick, but you had a long rise time, it would kind of like smooth out that rise. It wouldn't just be so sudden. So if you feel like you don't have enough control with your mod wheel, you can try and increase the rise time to smoothen things out. Okay, then moving on, we have this drive, which is really where the source is in here. It has this really nice warm drive. We just turn down the output. So you can really hear the nice warm drive on there. And when you shift to more towards the bass speaker over there, you hear the drive even more. I think it sounds nice over there. Okay, so yeah, that's the Rotary. Really cool effect. I use it a lot. It's kind of hard to understand, but just play around with it and you'll start to figure out settings that sound good to you, depending on which patch you're using. So next up, we are going to be covering the modifications and the trimmers. Okay, so onto the modifications tab. What the modifications tab, well, this top panel over here does is just provide us with additional modulation options. So in our main synth, for example, in the triple VCO section, we have an option here to do some tune mod, some shape mod. We have options to, modulate the filter cutoff using these two controls, and that's about it for this option. So wherever you have a case where, let's say, you wanted to modify something else, but there's no control in the main synth, there might be an option to do it here in the modifications tab. So in this case, we have options for FM and cross mod depth. So if you recall, FM and cross mod are basically the same thing. They just got different names in different synths. So for example, in dual VCO, cross mod is over here, and it sounds pretty much the same as FM, whereas the triple VCO has this FM over here. So let's say we wanted to modulate this amount. There's no option to do that here. We can come down to the modifications tab and turn this knob and we will get some modulation. But we need to use a modulation source. So let's just use LFO2 here, for example. And you'll notice as soon as we assign it to an LFO source and turn this knob, that little M appears. And that just means that it's being modulated. You can see it there. It just appears. It's not a button or anything, it's just an indication. Okay, so if we listen to that. So there you can hear the FM starting to modulate there. We can even control it with maybe envelope 1 to give it a bit more of an obvious control. Okay, and then we have noise and dual VCO mix. So on synths where there is some noise, we can modulate that. And on, if you go to like dual VCO over here, you'll see that on these ones you have an option for noise. So in this case, you could modulate that noise. Okay, and then we go on to filter section. So filter has a resonance modifier, and we can just assign that if we want to let's try envelope 2. And then we have filter FM, which if you remember just gives us a nice bit of grit, so maybe that would be a good one to do for this bass. Yeah, that gives the beginning of the sound a bit more crunch. Okay, and then we also have feedback mod. We can hear how that sounds. I've already explained what feedback sounds like. Okay, so that's pretty much this panel over here explained. Next up we have this lower panel over here, and this we can use to basically change the existing modification sources or modulation sources. And I'll explain what I mean now. I think this can be a little bit of a confusing concept, but basically we can assign any of these to like LFOs or envelopes or something, and it will change the envelope. So let's focus on envelope 2 for now. So we've got envelope 2 here. I'm going to assign it to the pitch of, let's say, all of them. And now that's pitching down. We could then set invert to envelope 2. And that does nothing yet, but what we then need to do is go to this and change it to invert. So because we're assigning it invert, it's using an envelope 2 and inverting it. So now it's going from low to high. So invert does exactly that, it inverts the values. And then rectify will basically make any negative value a positive value. And this won't work on envelope 2 because envelope 2 only has positive values, so it won't change it. For this we would have to use something like an LFO. So let's use LFO 2 and just hear how that sounds initially. Okay, LFO 2 is currently on a saw down, so I'm going to change it to a sine wave. It's going to increase the rate. Okay, and I'm just going to increase the amount so it's more obvious. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to rectify LFO 2 and change this to rectify. So now we're only getting positive values. It's still got a sine wave, but it's essentially sitting above 0 values constantly. So the entire, if you imagine this as like our line, and the sine wave goes up and below that line, instead of doing that, it's now pushed it up so that it's starting over here, touching the line, and then going back up. Okay, and then quantize will basically take this small LFO, the smooth LFO shape, the sine wave, and basically break it up into steps and give us like a very jumpy kind of LFO. If we set that to LFO 2 and change this to quantize, now we get that jumping up and jumping between the steps. And it has this little dial over here which allows you to start to smooth those jumps out. Until eventually it almost seems like it's not being quantized anymore. Okay, and then we have lag, and lag will just basically smooth out any sudden jumps. So let's change this to lag, and we'll set this waveform to our sine wave. So set this first to LFO2, and we'll change this to our saw. Well, let's change it to a square, because the square has sudden jumps in volume. And we change this to LFO2. So as you can hear over there, it's kind of jumping up and down. And then if we change this to lag, and then hit the note, you can hear it's kind of starting to bend the note instead of it jumping up and down. And the higher we turn this, the more of a bend we get. So it starts to smooth out that sharp square wave and make it a bit smoother. Okay, and then we get onto the multiply and add here. So what we can do here is we can multiply two modulation sources. So let's say LFO1 and LFO2, we can multiply them together, and then we can start to get like really interesting shapes. So let's try that. Let's multiply LFO1 and LFO2. Where is that? LFO2. And then we will set this to multiply. So now it's multiplying this triangle with this square, and it's getting some weird shape. Let's try a square and a saw. So we can get some really weird shapes here. Let's try assigning that multiply to the filter cutoff and see how that sounds. Yeah, very, very cool. And then the add is just basically adding them together. So if we add a saw and a square, let's try that. LFO1 plus LFO2. And then we change this to add. Let me try another one. Let's try a saw down with a saw up. Start to increase the rate. Can get some pretty crazy results. So that's it for the modification tab. Pretty cool stuff. Definitely make use of it. You'll get some really interesting sounds. So on to the next one, which is going to be trimmers. Okay, so now we're onto the trimmers tab over here. And I'm just going to set a new preset. We're going to do the mini poly. Just because we're going to be playing chords and things like that. Let's just make a sound that we can work with here that's not too harsh. Okay, maybe something like that will do. Okay. So it's just starting up at the top left here. You'll see we've got a whole bunch of knobs. There's 8 in each row, and they have these corresponding LEDs. So what these all represent are basically voices. So you'll see every time I tap this key, the C3, a new one lights up. And the reason why only the first 6 ones are lighting up is because our current voices are set to 6. So if we set that to 8, you'll see they all light up to the end. So every time I'm hitting the key, it's assigning that note to a new voice in the synth. And what we can do is we can detune these voices from each other so that each single hit is slightly different from the next. And that's what gives it this like really analog feel, is that each note isn't perfect, like in the perfect pitch together. And you can't really hear it now. That's because these pitch differences are very, very subtle. And we can increase those amounts by using this detune amount. So you'll notice the ones that are like very out of pitch, like this one, will sound very different to that one, for example, that sounds like it's in pitch. Okay, so what happens if you set it to 16 voices? Because we've only got 8 knobs here, we can control all of them because they are kind of, what they've done is they've paired them up. So the first knob is assigned to voice 1 and voice and voice 9. So if I hit this, you can see it first blinks this first LED on each one, and then it'll use the second one. So this knob is controlling voice 1 and 9, this is controlling voice 2 and 10, this is controlling voice 3 and 11, and so on and so forth. So that's what happens if we have 16 voices. Okay, and the reason why there are 3 rows here is that each one of these is assigned to an oscillator. Okay, so next up we have this voice map modulator. And what this does is it allows us to map certain modulations to each voice. So let me just set this back to 8, just for simplicity's sake. And what I'm going to do is just create like a series of notes here, so that we can see it cycling through this. And then what we can do is use this voice map modulator with the voice map modifier to do different things. So for example, if we set this envelope 2 to voice map and play the sequence, we don't really notice anything change. If I start to increase the amounts on these, so let's say 1 and 3 and 5, you'll notice the filter opens up on voice 1, 3, and 5 because we've increased the amount here on voice map. Now it's doing it on 7 too. What if we make a different pattern? Maybe we have these 2 down, maybe one of these negative ones. So using this, you can create some pretty interesting sequences and modulations. And just like this, if you have 16 voices, this first modifier will apply to voice 1 and 9, and then so on and so forth. Okay, we've already gone over detune amount. That just increases the amount of detune that we're seeing on these, or the range, I'll say. And then voice drift basically creates a subtle, almost the voice like sways a little bit away from the point where you set it to. We get some drift. And you can it's very subtle, you can't really hear it that well. Okay, and then the voices and stack, that's exactly the same as in the main over here with the voices and stack. They've just added it there for your convenience basically, because when you're working in here you're probably going to be changing stuff around. And then we get our variance tab over here, And this will just let you make things sound a little more organic, a little bit more chaotic, and less perfect. So we've got cutoff here, which basically adds some variance to our cutoff filter, and as well as the Q or the emphasis or the resonance. So if I turn this up and maybe set this back to our envelope so that we can hear the filter quite clearly, let me just do this. Okay, so if I start to turn this up so we get a bit of resonance, and turn up this cutoff, pay attention to how the resonance sounds. Okay, so that is now changing basically based on per voice basis. It's giving us a slightly different variation on each voice with the emphasis amount. So that's why the resonance is changing on each hit. And we can't adjust those amounts using the knobs, but what we can do is click this button, and that generates a bunch of random values for each voice. Okay, and then we get the envelope. So at the moment we're using an envelope to modify the filter cutoff. If we change this and increase it, then that envelope decay and sustain are going to change their values, like according to our random values, which are set by clicking this button. Okay, and then we've got PW, which is our pulse width. We set this over here. Might be a bit more obvious on a oscillator that actually uses pulse width. So there you can hear each note is the same. Increase this and we're getting some modulation. Okay, and then if we do it to glide, if we're using the glide function over here, you'll notice that the glide timing is changing. It's the same now, but if I increase this, we're now getting some random timings on those glides. So those are pretty cool if you're looking to create some variation in, like, let's say you have an arpeggiator that doesn't actually change really throughout the course of the track. You want to make it a bit more interesting. Giving stuff a little bit of variance will help create some interest in there, as well as adding some, oscillator voice detune, maybe some modulation. All of these things can come together and create some really interesting sounds. And we've got this LED color dial, and as you can see, that's just changing the color of our LEDs on this. Doesn't do anything to our sound or anything, just looks cool. Personally, I like the blue one. So I'll keep it there. And then moving on, we've got this reset phase. So this basically just tells the oscillators to reset their phase. And using this can really help with sounds that, let's say you have like percussive sounds, or a sound with an attack that you don't want to change. You want it to be the same every single time. You can turn these up on the oscillators, or per oscillator basis, and your basically the waveform will start at the same phase every time, reset at the exact same phase, and then you'll have very consistent hits. Sorry, I forgot to say, the reason why we probably weren't hearing it is because it relies on this oscillator reset transient mode. Okay, even there we don't really hear it that much. Okay, so again, if you are making sounds that have like a sharp attack like this one, try playing with these different transient modes, because they will produce different sounds. So this analog sound, each one will sound slightly different. I'm not really going to go too much into these because it doesn't really matter. Just know that, you know, playing with them will help, or either help or make a sound worse. Just try them, you know, when you're working with really plucky percussive sounds, and they could help. And if you want to use reset phase, just remember that you need to use oscillator reset mode. Okay, and then onto bipolar noise. You can turn this on or off, but this is basically just to make older presets compatible with the newer version of Diva. So I'd recommend just leaving that on. And then we got stack tune. Stack tune is it allows us to tune each stack. So we have 6 stacks here. We can detune each one by up to 2 octaves to the left and 2 octaves to the right. So 2 up and 2 down. So with this you can make like, let's say you have 6 stacks, and we have 6 stacks of saws with 16 voices. Okay, that's really loud. Okay, so now what we can do is we can start to tune our stacks. So let's say we put one up, 7 semitones. That's a 5th. Now we're getting a perfect 5th chord. We can tune the 3rd stack up to maybe another octave. 12. And let's tune this one up maybe 3 semitones. Or let's try maybe 15. We're starting to build chords, and even though I'm hitting one note, we're now getting a chord. So you can build like really massive, like mega saws with this, especially if you're only using octaves. Let's try that. That one there. And this one, maybe 1 octave down. You know, that's when we can start to get some really nice big sounds. So yeah, that's our stack tune, and that pretty much covers the trimmers section. And that's it really for all the controls that are going to be affecting the sounds that we're making. Other than that, we've got the scope, which is just our oscilloscope, which we've been using before. And the scope is, well, the only controls we have is the frequency and the scale. So we can kind of just adjust these parameters to help us look at the waveform how we want to look at it, basically. So if we bring down the scale, let's say this is going out of the picture, we can bring down the scale. Frequency basically is like the refresh rate almost. So we're basically just zooming into the sound as we bring it down. Okay, so that's as far as I'm going to be taking it in this video. I won't be covering the presets tab because I feel like it's pretty intuitive. You know, you have a bunch of presets, you can choose them, you can save them, you can favorite them and mark them as junk so that they don't show up. If you have any questions regarding that, I just suggest you click here and go to user guide. open up the user guide and then just browse to a section, like for example the preset browser, and then you'll probably find your answer pretty quickly like that. And the same thing with this options tab. I'm not going to go over anything in here. It's all pretty, intuitive. And if it's not, you can once again go back here and go to the user guide. So thank you if you watched all the way to the end. I hope you found it useful and that you now have a solid understanding of all the things you can do inside Diva. And I hope you go off and make some really awesome sounds of your own. So thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next video, guys.